Hey there, Father Brian here. I hope you're doing well. You know, maybe you're staying at home in quarantine. Maybe you're getting out a little bit more. Maybe you've been to Mass with us. Maybe you haven't. Anyway, nice to see you. I wanted to give you a little peek into what a priest might do on his day off. Now, not every day off is the same like this, but specifically today on my day off, it's brew day. I'm going to make a batch of pineapple wheat beer. And so I wanted to give you a little peek about what that's like and some of the ins and outs of that. I'm going to call it Molokai Pineapple Wheat Ale. Molokai, of course, after St. Damien Molokai. If you know, he was a priest who served a colony of sick people in the Hawaiian Islands, on the island of Molokai, I think. And so this is, it's a pineapple wheat. I've always wanted to make a beer with fresh fruit, and I wanted to try pineapple, and it seemed to go with a wheat beer, be good for summer, and so I think pineapple, Hawaii, let's name it after St. Damien. This is the third batch I've brewed since I've been at St. Vincent, but years before that, I've made probably a dozen batches of beer before. It's a really fun, rewarding hobby. Maybe I'll convince you that it's worth your time. Any kids that are watching, I'm not making beer. I'm making wheat juice, so it's not very good. You won't like it. But anyway, if you're with me so far, have fun as we kind of go through this. Let me show you. This is my little brewery downstairs in the basement of the rectory. It's kind of a mess, but you can see a lot of empty bottles I've collected that, I will use to bottle my brews. Here's the ingredients I ordered for this batch. Here's the big glass carboy that's going to sit into ferment, and various other things, and I'm going to get those out and get started in just a minute. Now, the first step in the process is to clean all of our equipment, and so in here I've got some sanitizer. I'm filling up that bucket right now, and it's a Star San sanitizer. And here's the soap, the cleaner we use to actually wash the stuff. So these are brewer recommended chemicals. So we're gonna let this sit in the sanitizer water for a while. And this pot here, I'm gonna have to put some water in there and then give it a good scrub. Make sure there's nothing clinging to the sides there. We don't want any extra flavors in our wheat beer. So the most important ingredient of beer is actually sanitation. So everything, this liquid is gonna be boiled once we start the beer mash. And so everything that's gonna touch it after it's boiled is gonna have to be sanitized, because the point here being, I can't get this hose to stay in here by itself. The point being that eventually this beer is going to go into a big glass container with a bunch of yeast and quarantine there for a few weeks. And we don't want any extra germs other than that yeast, because they'll start munching on that sugar and make something probably pretty gross that we don't want. So we want just the yeast to be the only bacteria and organism in there as much as we possibly can. Hopefully there's no coronavirus icky things in there. So we need to sanitize everything that's going to come in contact with the beer after it's boiled, so that nothing foreign gets in there and won't ruin the taste. So the yeast can be happy by themselves. So I'm going to scrub this pot out and let these things soak. So I've got this water heating up now. Everything's been cleaned. Those things are soaking a little longer. I get my water purified from Schnucks, so you can use tap water. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but I prefer to use purified. Every philosophy is a little different. They do different things. So this pot was a gift from my parents for Christmas, because they know I like to brew, and it's really wonderful. It's got a valve on there and a thermometer, so I know exactly what temperature I'm getting. And so that's been really nice. These things aren't cheap. So what we're going to do is, let's look at our ingredients here. We have malt extract, and so this is kind of grains. This is a syrup from grains that were malted, and then the sugars were kind of steeped and extracted and then boiled down to the syrup. And so it's like pre-made beer juice, and so we can just put that right in there. We're going to boil that. We got two different bags of that. And then here's some regular grains, and so we're going to have to steep these on our own. We're going to steep them at around 160 degrees Fahrenheit for half an hour. So I'll show you what that looks like. We'll get them in a bag here once the water's hot enough. And the point of this is that, all this is basically sugar that's come from grains, and then this is some extra grains for flavor. This is basically wheat malt, where you get the flavor of wheat beer. And then we got some grains for flavor. What else we got here? This is crystal malt, which is just another kind of malt. And so then our hops for later. So we're gonna get working on that. And you won't see any pineapple today. I know it said it's a pineapple wheat ale, but we don't want to get the pineapple in there before the fermentation starts, because the yeast will kind of eat up all the sweetness from the pineapple and just leave the tartness. And I'm not trying to make a sour beer today. So the pineapple is going to come much later, in a couple weeks. Once the fermentation is mostly done, I've got to figure out how I want to add the pineapple. Some people say it's best to cook it first, and it kind of caramelizes the flavor and keeps it solid, and then I'll add it to the fermenter and let the pineapple juices mix in. But you won't see that today. So as of just brew day, it's like we're making just a regular wheat beer. So I'm gonna get going on that. Let's go ahead and add some of this malt extract syrup. It's extremely sticky and extremely viscous and heavy. So there it goes. Really kind of weird, isn't it? So we're putting, how many, 4 pounds of this in there? So that's a lot of sugar, and this is going to be the main food that the yeast is going to eat. And this stuff doesn't have to be boiled, but it helps for the steeping and for the hops later when we boil it, because this has already been boiled and condensed in a factory. So this is just pure food for the yeast. And this is about half of what we're going to end up using for a 5-gallon batch. We're going to add the rest of it after the boil is done, and then add the rest of the water. We're doing a half batch. So instead of using this pre-made syrup, I could use all grains, about 10 pounds of them. And I've done that before, but I don't really have the equipment to do that big a batch. You'd have to use about 7 gallons of water, and that would just about overflow. See that 7 right there? If this is boiling, just about overflow this pot. So I could do it, but I'm not gonna do it today. It's nice to do the half batch. So we're gonna add this, and then we're gonna steep those grains pretty soon when it gets hot enough. Okay, now we've got our temperature up to 168, 166, and we don't wanna get past 170. I've turned the heat off, and we have our grains stewing in there, our specialty grains in this mesh bag. Okay, you can see the honey malt and crystal malt there. And we're just gonna let that sit for 30 minutes, so I better turn my timer on. And with the heat off, it should maintain temperature around 160, 150, 140 without getting too much colder for about half an hour. If need be, I can turn the heat back on and heat it back up to that sweet spot. Okay, well, we got the grains out of there. Now the water is boiling. You can see how much it foams, and I've already had to kind of tame it down a little bit. And now it's time to add the magic ingredient, the hops. And so we are going to add our first batch of hops. These are called Willamette hops, and measured out 0.85 ounces on that. And the hops have quite a few purposes in the beer. They're going to see how you probably can't see it through the smoke, but the foam turned a little greener when that went in, and it always causes a little bit of a reaction. Just trying to cut the foam down. The hops have a few purposes. Obviously, makes the beer pretty bitter, and you know, helps preserve it, and some of the acids balance out the sweetness in the beer, because beer is usually pretty sweet depending on the recipe. And when you add the hops is actually pretty important, and how much. So if this were an IPA, we would add a lot of hops at the beginning, because the longer you boil the hops, the more bitterness you get out of it. When you add hops later, even right at when it's done boiling, you get a lot of the floral aroma in the hops, but you don't get as much bitterness. So, you know, some beers are more bitter than others, and we add more hops at the beginning to boil them and draw out that alpha acid, that bitterness, and develop that. But this is a wheat beer, and so it's not going to be that bitter. So we only added a little bit of Willamette, which is more of a, not so much a spicy, bitter hop as much as giving it kind of an earthy flavor. So just to balance that maltiness. So we're gonna do this, and it's boiling. I've got the timer set, and then when there's 10 minutes left in the boil, it's gonna boil for an hour, which is a pretty standard amount for a beer. Then we'll add our next batch of hops and a couple other things. So I'm gonna try to get this foaming under control a little bit here, and I'll check back with you. Still watching the boil. It's about halfway done. I've got my next addition of hops, El Dorado hops, to add with 10 minutes left in the boil when we get to there. And while I watch the boil and make sure things are going well, this is what I like to read: How to Brew. And if you want to get started at home brewing, this is the best book I've found. Pretty big. It's got stuff for beginners, and then it's got all the details you could ever know. And I've got other brewing books, and they're all pretty good, but this is my favorite one. And as far as just reading through it, I haven't gotten very far. I can't find my bookmark right there, you know, so learning about yeast. So, you know, some of this is review, but there's a lot more to learn, as you can see. There's so much. So, you know, if you're interested in this, I recommend starting with this book. And, you know, to kind of talk about that, if anybody wants to get into home brewing as a hobby, I think there's a homebrew store in Fruitland up past Jackson that the owner there is really good. And I think if you wanted to go and get all your equipment for your first brew with all the basic stuff, it might cost you about $100, including ingredients. And that's with the equipment, you know, depending on how you do it. You can do it in your kitchen. And then every time you go to make another batch, your ingredients might be around $30. And so for 5 gallons of beer, I find, depending on the bottles I use, it might make 40 to 50 bottles of high quality beer. So it's definitely worth the money in the long run, talking about buying craft beer. So it's not an expensive hobby. It's worth the money you put into it and worth the time. And so, you know, this brew day usually takes me about 4 or 5 hours between getting the equipment out, cleaning it up, doing the steeping, doing the boiling, putting it in the fermenter, and then cleaning everything up again and putting it away. So it's a commitment. That's why it's a day off thing that I do every couple months or so. And then you have to wait about 2 or 3 weeks for the fermenter, and then you might put it into another fermenter and do another week or two, and then you bottle it. And after you bottle it, and that's maybe an hour or two of work, you know, to actually get it into the bottles. I never tried kegging. I might do that in the future. And when you bottle it, then you have to wait 2 more weeks for it to do bottle conditioning, where it ferments a little bit more and gets that carbonation in the sealed bottle. And then, so all in all, you're looking at about a month and a half, depending on the recipe, depending on how prompt you are at getting it done. So it's worth the time you put into it. So I'll be back with you once the boil is over and we add our last hops. Okay, so the boil is still happening. We're getting ready for that to be over, but we need to wake up this yeast. It comes in a dry package, so we're going to just put it in some water and let it swim around. So in about half an hour, maybe we'll be ready to pitch the yeast and it'll be awake, okay? So it's been sleeping in and being generally lazy, so we need to give it some time to wake up and swim around. Okay, we're done with our boil. It's been 60 minutes. I just killed the heat, turned off the propane, and we are done boiling. Let me get my very last hop addition here. All right, and I will throw that in there. Okay, so these hops, of course, this is the end of the boil, no more boiling. So that means this flavor is not going to be very bitter or strong. It's going to be more of that floral hop smell, and not very much, because this is just a wheat beer. We don't want too much hoppiness. You can do a hoppy wheat beer, and I've done it before, but we're going for pineapple wheat. The hoppiness kind of conflicts with that. So we're not going to make it very hoppy smelling or very hoppy tasting, although we will be very hoppy once we drink it. And I'll get back with you at the next step. Okay, now this is pretty fun. I've got an immersion chiller in there. So this liquid was about 190 degrees after I added the rest of the malt extract, another 4-pound bag. And the yeast doesn't want it that hot, it's gonna die. The yeast wants it around 75 degrees, maybe 70. So we need to get it down. We're gonna add the rest of the water, because it's gonna be a 5-gallon batch, but we've only been using 3.5 gallons, and some of that boiled off. So I'm running hose water, cold water, through this copper pipe that has coils in there, and that's in the beer. And I'm still trying to keep it clean because it's been boiled. We want to keep it very sanitary. And basically, I don't have enough hands, but I'm going to put the phone away and shake that thing around inside the pot to cool it off faster. It might take a few minutes, but to get that water down to maybe 90 degrees, 100 degrees, and then we'll add it to the rest of the water. It'll be down to about 80, and we'll be in good shape for adding the yeast. So it's a really cool way to cool it down quick, and there's many other ways to do it, but this heat exchanger works pretty well. So I'll get back to you once it's in the fermenter ready to go. Okay, as you can see, we've chilled the wort. I put wort is what they call beer that's not fermented yet. No alcohol here, folks, okay? All wholesome stuff. And I've put it into our carboy. This is about 6 gallons, so I topped it up to a little over 5 gallons, and that way it's got some space, and we're gonna lose some volume when we transfer it to a different fermenter later. And let's see, I shook it around to get some oxygen in there. We want it to get oxygen now because the yeast need oxygen. But then we're going to seal it off from oxygen, so it can't get any more, because adding oxygen in later will oxidize the flavor. And so we want oxygen now, we don't want it later. So we shook it up a little bit, and now let's add our rehydrated yeast to it. Not the cleanest pour there, but didn't lose very much. Okay, now we just have to leave it alone. So basically that is our living organism that makes our beer for us. You know, we did some of the work, but they do most of it. And you can see the dark brown color, that's going to change. We're going to seal it up here with an airlock. There you go, nice and firm. And so you can see in there that there's, when it starts bubbling, when the yeast kind of gets activated, the airlock will be bubbling a little bit because the yeast is going to eat the sugars, some of the sugars, not all of them are digestible. And when the yeast eats the sugars, it'll poop out carbon dioxide and alcohol. The alcohol will stay there, the carbon dioxide will come out. So it takes about half a day to 1 day before it starts to get active, and it's active for like 5 days at its most active. And then it slows down, but it's still working slowly. But during that few day period, you can really see the yeast bubbling. So this is how we leave it, and the beer will change color a bit. The flavor is going to change. Just now I've poured a sample of the beer. First I have to get a original gravity reading to see what is the density of that wort, of that young beer. And then you compare that to what it is after it's done fermenting in the final product, and that's how you measure how much alcohol is in there to see what the difference is. There's no alcohol now, and so when we measure it after the fermentation, we will be able to tell comparatively how much alcohol is entered into that. So I'm going to try that right now and see how it tastes. And now we wait, and that's about it for a couple weeks. I can't wait to see it bubbling. And thanks for watching this far. If you watched this long video, I hope you enjoyed seeing one healthy hobby that priests sometimes have, but anybody can have. So if you're thinking about starting up home brewing, or you just want to come over and see how it's done sometime in person, that would be really cool. So one thing they say about brew day is that you can't have a brew day without having a brew in your hand. And so I opened my last batch of beer. This is called Mosaic Covenant, you know, like the Old Testament term. I called it that because it's made from only one kind of hop, Mosaic hops, and it's a session IPA, and so it turned out pretty good. Delicious. Cheers.